It was 12:15 in the morning on July 8, 1945. Clarence Bertucci took his position in the West Guard Tower at the P.O.W. camp. With reasons that have long remained unexplained, that young soldier added to the dark days of war by thrusting himself squarely into even more bitterness. Bertucci calmly loaded a 250 cartridge magazine into his machine gun and began firing into the tents of the sleeping prisoners below his guard tower. Bullets rained down, striking 30 of the 43 tents. Most had little time to react. It was over very quickly. It was a massacre in a Utah prison camp filled with Nazi soldiers.
The town of Salina lies quietly in a peaceful valley near the middle of the state of Utah. Nearby, the Sevier River winds its way northward. But the red rocks are still there, the juniper pines still grow on the hillsides, and this place has a curious tale to tell, not unlike so many others in the region. It is a story that belies all the apparent solitude in this area. As spring turned to summer of that year, the world was winding down from a horrible war. In Europe, the Germans had been pushed deep back into the fatherland. Surrender was imminent. During the war, each side took many prisoners. For many German prisoners of war, P.O.Ws, it meant a trip to the United States and internment in camps set up for this purpose. Most of these camps were administered by the army and established in remote areas of little strategic importance. For that reason, the endless expanse of the American West became home to many POWs during World War II. After the Germans had capitulated in Europe, 371,000 German POWs remained captives on American soil. In June of that year, a month after the armistice, 250 of these prisoners were brought north by train from a camp in Florence, Arizona, to Ogden, Utah. From there, they were transported in covered military vans to Salina, a small farming town in the middle of the state. The army had hastily converted an old CCC camp that had been built in the early 1930s into a branch camp. With so many American boys away at the war, it had become a common practice to use prisoner labor in the fields. Under the terms of the Geneva Convention, POWs cannot be forced to work in the war effort, but the war with Germany was over. The prisoners, while still interred, were paid a small stipend. Some of the captives had been in American POW camps for more than 2 years. The British in Tunisia had captured them. Others had just been conscripted into the service of the faltering German army to defend the homeland from the advancing Allies. After a short indoctrination, and it was determined that non-commissioned officers could be used as agricultural labor. The prisoners worked 6 days a week, with Sundays designated as a day of rest. The prison camp consisted of 43 tents, each housing up to 8 prisoners. 2 barbed wire fences surrounded the compound. Guard towers, 2 on the east side and 1 on the west, stood overlooking the prisoners' tents. In each guard tower were a machine gun that served as a quiet deterrent. The prisoners worked as directed and were generally considered well-behaved, posing no threat to discipline. Perhaps they realized that their lot was far better than those who had been left behind in war-torn Germany to face occupation, possibly by the dreaded Russians. Whatever the case, the 250 German soldiers at that time were model prisoners. Tragically, in a few brief moments shortly after midnight on July 8, all that had seemed so far removed from the war changed forever. U.S. Army PFC Clarence V. Bertucci was a guard at the Salina compound. The 23-year-old soldier was a native of New Orleans, Louisiana, with a 6th-grade education. He had joined the army in 1940 but had never really seen any action in the war. He had served in England with a field artillery unit but had been disciplined on 3 occasions. A quiet loner with few friends, he had been returned to the States and was playing out the war as a POW guard in the remoteness of central Utah. A few residents who had befriended Clarence Bertucci came to calling him Johnny. One of these was a young girl named Phyllis Powell. She would later remark, Johnny was angry. He told her, someday I will get my Germans, I will get my turn. It was Saturday, that warm July evening. Most of the young people in town that night had gathered at the Redmonto Dance Hall, some 5 miles up the road. It was a popular spot on summer Saturday evenings, and young, off-duty soldiers were always welcome. For a while, Bertucci lingered nearby listening to the music. Some reports say that he then stopped by a local bar on his way back to the camp, where he had several beers. He went on to say, something exciting was going to happen later tonight, something that was really going to shake up this town. Bertucci then left. It was after 11 p.m. he was scheduled to go on duty about midnight, and that was less than an hour away. At about 12:15 a.m. on the early morning of July 8, 1945, Clarence Bertucci took his position in the West Guard Tower at the POW camp. It was then, for reasons that have long remained unexplained, that a young soldier thrust himself squarely into even more bitterness on the pages of Utah history. Bertucci calmly loaded a 250 cartridge magazine into his machine gun and began firing into the tents of the sleeping prisoners below his guard tower. Bullets rained down, striking 30 of the 43 tents. Several of the terrified prisoners scrambled from their cots and began to run about the compound looking for cover. Others huddled in their tents. A few prisoners pulled mattresses over themselves for protection. Most had little time to react. It was over very quickly. The camp's commander, Colonel Albert Cornell, was sleeping in the officer's room near the base of the West Guard Tower. At the crack of the first shots, he leapt from his bed, ran to the door, and shouted for the firing to cease. The shooting continued. As he fumbled to reload, Colonel Cornell and Corporal Delmeyer O. Butts climbed the guard tower, subdued Bertucci, and put him under guard. When order had been restored in the compound, it was discovered that 6 German prisoners had been killed outright. 2 more died in the hospital, and another several days later from his injuries. 20 had been wounded. The victims were loaded into trucks and driven to the hospital. There were only 4 empty beds, so many were treated in the halls and waiting rooms. Several received aid on the hospital's front lawn. Local military authorities imposed a strict news blackout. In the wake of the killings, Phyllis Powell told her mother, "Well, Johnny got his Germans." In custody, Bertucci showed no remorse and admitted no pride. He confessed that he had committed the act because he simply did not like Germans and wanted to kill them. With burial scheduled for the military cemetery at Fort Douglas near Salt Lake City. Military authorities did not permit the Nazi flag to be used during the ceremonies, and no German national flags could be found. The victims were buried in unmarked American khakis. No German uniforms were available. Finally, the men were laid to rest with the sounding of taps. The 9 prisoners who died had come from all over Germany. They ranged in age from 22 to 48. 6 had been captured in Tunisia in 1943 while fighting in the Afrika Korps under Rommel. 2 more had been captured in France just after the invasion of Normandy, and the last was seized in Germany on March 30, 1945, just a month before the surrender of his homeland to the Allies. The Salt Lake City newspapers published scathing editorials within a few days condemning the massacre as an act of cowardly, unprovoked, unparalleled, irrational violence. At a time when the world was already reeling from disclosures of German and Japanese atrocities, Bertucci's act not only betrayed the trust he accepted as a guard, but shamed his comrades, embarrassed his countrymen, and disgraced the army in which he is enrolled. A cry went up for immediate punishment or confinement as a madman so that Bertucci would be deprived forever of every opportunity to repeat the deplorable, atrocious deed. On August 28, some 6 weeks after the shooting, military authorities announced that Bertucci had been determined to be mentally unbalanced. The unemotional killer of 9 German prisoners of war was removed from the United States Army and sentenced to a mental institution, the Mason General Hospital in New York State. How long he remained there is unknown, but Veterans Administration records show that he died in 1969. Little remains of the old CCC camp that was converted into a prisoner of war camp in 1945. Currently, there is a movement to have a monument placed on the site to remember the 9 who died there properly. At the time of the tragedy, residents were angered and grieved over the deaths of the 9 German prisoners. That unsuspecting victims could be killed in their town stained their honor and that of all Americans. For many of the wounded, it was a long and painful journey back to their homes in a crushed homeland. Several grudgingly admitted that as long as they had been wounded, their care in the United States was far better than what they would have received in Germany. After all, the Americans had penicillin, the Germans did not. Most of the wounded returned home without their families ever having been told that they had been wounded. Some of the wounded and families of the dead applied to the United States for some compensation. They were told that, at the time of its surrender, Germany had signed a document denying Germans the right to make any demands on the American government. Prisoners had been allotted a small sum in return for their labor in the agricultural fields of the United States. An accounting was made, and the monies earned before their deaths were paid. Those who had died were provided with a proper burial. The victims of the tragedy can be found in graves at the historic Fort Douglas Cemetery near Salt Lake City. Their headstones stand quietly at the far end of the graveyard and offer no clue as to how these German soldiers came to this place. What must be a curiosity to some visitors is that the death date shown on the 7 matching headstones is always the same, July 9, 1945. It should be noted that, for the most part, American prisoner of war camps were run correctly to provide for the well-being and good health of the internees, in marked contrast to the German camps. The Japanese camps, where nearly 30% never came home, and the American camps must be viewed as exemplary. War is an evil business. Such tragedies should not be just explained away but rather remembered as a reminder that such things should never happen again.
Personal note. Much of the information in this text was graciously provided by Virginia Dickert, a longtime resident and the locally recognized authority on the tragedy. Lois Archuleta of the Salt Lake City Library was also very helpful in resurrecting old newspaper articles for this story.